And now Russia's nuclear forces on special alert.
Угрозой без малого все европейские столицы, если наши ракеты встанут в Калининграде. Берлин, Варшава, все Прибалты, Париж, Бухарест, Прага. Конечно, американские базы в Германии.
Now Russia's been accused of planning a campaign of sabotage.
Пангдален, Рамштайн.
By way of explaining what we're about to do, I am first going to tell you a little bit about the country called Tibet. In 1903, Britain invaded Tibet, and as the Tibetan people defended their home, the British Indian Army searched the mountain snow for Russians. Tibet was looted, and the proud and shy country was opened up for British trade and the expansion of capitalism. Hundreds of people died, mainly Tibetans. But the British Home Government back in London were not happy. This invasion was not sanctioned behaviour. The British Indian government had gone rogue, and the invasion was the obsessive act of one person, George Nathaniel Curzon. In 1899, Curzon had been made Viceroy of India, that OG British colonial territory. And this put him in a tricky position. As the man in charge of Britain's most valuable stolen property, he had to stop anyone else from stealing it. And the country sending Curzon extremely bad vibes over the Himalayas was Russia. Tibet shares a border with India, so if Russia went after India, they would have to go through Tibet. To make matters worse, there was also China. They weren't very fond of Britain for many reasons, and were exerting a control over Tibet that Curzon didn't like. He had written many letters to the 13th Dalai Lama, the ruler of Tibet, and these had been returned unopened with the plea that China might get mad at us. Tibet just wanted to mind their own business, tucked away in the inaccessible cold. So Curzon felt he was up against a wall of silence, an impassable blockade. Tibet was refusing to talk, but Curzon thought he was hearing whispers of something else. He thought China was conspiring with Russia. He thought China was planning to hand Tibet over to Russian control. The thing that Curzon feared the most, as Russia would be one step closer to India, stretching its tentacles in anticipation. He abhorred the idea of Russian influence in Tibet and was convinced that shadowy figures were negotiating beyond the lofty ice barrier that blocked his view. Like the sinister Russian monk, Dorchiev, who was supposedly both advisor to Tsar Nicholas I and tutor to the Dalai Lama. So when Curzon's paranoia finally became unbearable, he sent a man called Francis Edward Younghusband to break into Tibet. Younghusband was under orders to conduct a military expedition, or special military operation, if you will. Younghusband went in expecting Russian troops and Russian weapons among the great barren peaks of mystery. But there were only confused Tibetans, defending their country with out-of-date matchlock guns. The first skirmish saw the death of 628 out of 2,000 Tibetan troops, and with blood on his hands, Younghusband pushed forward to the capital, Lhasa. There was still not a trace of Russia to be found. There was no thing that should not be in the mountains of madness. I think it's safe to say that in this case, Curzon had been a little paranoid. Later in his career, he would become known for histrionics and exaggeration. Critics have called his obsession with the Russian threat anachronistic, out of date, a mania from a man who was irrationally scared of Russia. Luckily, we don't have that problem today. This is a Russian news show from July 2024, selling a half-baked fantasy in which Russia subjects Western culture to a nuclear firestorm.
В принципе, достаточно 3 ракет, и эта цивилизация рухнет.
It's a propaganda piece, designed by Russian media to get their viewers riled up, but also to reassure them that their country has the power to destroy everything. And Sheerness in Scotland. It's also designed to strike fear into the hearts of Europeans everywhere. And you may have seen a lot of this kind of thing in the last few years. The war in Ukraine, Russian bots meddling in Western democracy, these are issues that affect us all, and the media will not spare us from the horror. You may also have heard the term Russophobia, which is an irrational fear of Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But Russophobia is also an intense and irrational fear or hatred of Russia. And maybe it makes sense to be afraid of Russia. Russia is an energy superpower and one of the world's largest nuclear powers. It's run by an unstable ex-KGB hardman called Vladimir Putin, who has installed himself as dictator for life, rides bears half naked, and, according to a video that surfaced in the 2010s, sang to Hollywood celebrities in an attempt to win the approval of the Western bourgeoisie.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill.
But that's Putin's sober karaoke. I want to see what his drunk karaoke is like.
I wanna know what love is. I want you to show me.
And need I remind you, Putin also recently invaded a neighbouring country. But he has also offered a hand of friendship to those who want to escape Western liberalism. If you think the West is too liberal and too gay, you can hop on over to Russia and get a residency permit. In the past, Putin has only made this offer to a select few, including US conspiracy theorist and Putin stan Alex Jones. Now, Jones doesn't like to brag, but you might be interested to know that his neck is freakishly large.
And I'm not bragging about it, it's actually freakish. My neck is freakishly large.
But now Putin's generous offer is open to all of us. I hear they are short on military recruits. So, which way, Western man? In a maelstrom of information and disinformation, it's hard to tell where your next wave of existential dread should come from. On the face of it, it seems there are plenty of reasons to be afraid of Russia today. And it seems there are plenty of reasons to be afraid of Russia today. Russian tentacles stretch far, from rounding up political dissidents in Eastern Europe to leaving poison on people's doorsteps in Wiltshire. And Russia has the nerve to accuse critics of Russophobia. The Kremlin makes out that legitimate criticism is the product of outright hatred. You hate Mother Russia? Straight to Gulag. Do not collect potato. I asked two Russians if that joke was Russophobic. Neither of them thought Russo would mind. So how did we get to this point of such a strong division between Russia and the West? And what does this mean for today's geopolitical situation? If Russophobia is an irrational fear of Russia, then what is a rational fear of Russia?
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, on Blueberry Hill, where I found you. The moon stood still.
In 2022, British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss suggested arming Moldova in preparation for a Russian invasion. She was concerned that if Russia succeeded in Ukraine, they would go mad with power and push further into Europe and onwards into the Baltic states. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was annoyed by this. He felt Liz was unfairly calling Russia out on being a territory-grabbing menace. He felt seen. Lavrov thought Liz was getting her ideas from a roughly 200-year-old document called The Testament of Peter the Great. Peter was the first emperor of all Russia until 1725. He was a modernizer, and his big thing was introducing his country to the Western European way of doing things. But he had territorial ambitions as well. He wanted Russia to be a naval power, and everyone in the early 1700s noticed the stirrings of Russia's military intent. Now, a lot of Peter's ambitions were abject failures, but in the tradition of all the best Bond villains, he wanted to tell everyone about his big ideas. So he put pen to paper and wrote the document that would change the course of history. He wrote his testament, a master plan for Russia's future territorial expansion. He gave advice for future Russian emperors, then told them that they should start wars in Turkey and Persia. This would distract everyone while Russia took over Afghanistan, and then Russia could go for the big prize, India. Once Russia had India, they would have the rest of Europe, and even the rest of the world, at their military and economic mercy. Terrifying. At least that's what Europe thought when the Testament burst onto the scene in 1756, about 30 years after Peter's death. So this is where the idea of Russia as an expansionist imperial power comes from. Well, that and, the literal invasion, special military operation happening right now. However, if you're paying attention, you might be thinking, 30 years is a long time. That's a bit suspicious, isn't it? Let's put a pin in that for now. It wasn't until the Napoleonic Wars that the Testament really cemented itself in European thought. Because when the little-known historical figure Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to invade Russia and needed justification, he published Peter's Testament to remind everyone that if France didn't go after Russia, Russia would come after everyone else. Russia needed to be put in their place, so onward French army and protect us all. Except Russia froze them out and Napoleon failed. As they say, don't invade Russia in the winter, except he didn't. He invaded in the summer with the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Don't fuck with Russia. And as Napoleon's dream of a French empire crashed and burnt, a power vacuum opened up. Russia was suddenly a serious contender for the position of imperial megalomaniac, coming up against that other great colonial egotist, Britain. This started a century-long, tense and messy fight for military supremacy and influence in Central Asia. A continuous series of frontier wars and expeditions, including 3 Anglo-Afghan wars and the Crimean War, all of which were nasty conflicts fought in the liminal spaces of imperial control. This became known as the Great Game. Or, if you're Russian, it was called the Tournament of Shadows, which is an objectively cooler name, so if you're keeping score, that's a point to Russia right there. Afghanistan, Persia and Tibet were 3 of the countries up for grabs, but ultimately this was a battle over India, which you might remember from Peter's Testament. And in the 1830s, Britain was just about having a heart attack at the thought that Russia might already be chipping away at British power in India from the inside, not just from the outside. The British were worried that Russia would take advantage of the fact that quite a few Indians were more than a little pissed off with British rule. If Russia started whispering in their ears, lending moral support and more, then Britain could be in trouble. With all these rumours and whispers and all-out fighting, Russophobia didn't seem so unjustified. The real Great Game was being played out in the mind. Throughout the 1800s, Britain never forgot the testament of Peter the Great, and as they came up against a series of Russian rulers who seemed hell-bent on expanding Russia's influence and reaching with grasping bear claws towards India, the British were mired in a fetid swamp of suspicion and fear. As someone famous once said, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. And even though Curzon's ill-advised invasion of Tibet was technically the last conflict of the Great Game, we still have not forgotten the words of some Russian dude from the 1700s. But there's a catch. Peter's Testament, that written record of Russia's dangerous ambition, was a forgery. It is an example of black propaganda that claims to have been written by those it sets out to damage. Peter the Great never wrote that he was going to bend the world to his will by holding India hostage. The document was a fake. Over a century of chaos and death have been prompted by lies, and these lies still echo in today's geopolitics. But whoever wrote that testament clearly had a sickle to grind with Russia. And, more worryingly, why did everyone else jump on the bandwagon? Why was the feeling that Russia was out there, stalking Western Europe, so compelling? You can go out there and make up any nonsense propaganda you like. This is happening every day. But for it to have an impact, it must be believed. A large enough number of people have to accept it. It has to make its way to the top. Now for sure, Russia wasn't some meek, mild little wallflower, but they had no interest in India. Rather, they probably wanted to secure their borders against Britain's expansionist intent. It's kinda ironic that Britain wanted to punish Russia for showing the slightest interest in the very thing that they revelled in throughout the 1800s, being an imperial power. And don't go ahead and fall into the trap of thinking, well, people believed the testament because at some level it was true. No, there was something deeper and darker at work. The testament of Peter the Great tapped into an already existing worry about Russia, a rift that was already present between Russia and the West. A divide that had already been around for centuries before the Testament appeared in 1756, and centuries before Bonaparte's little misadventure in 1812. There is no foundation in solid fact here, but rather a foundation in older fiction. So get comfy and light some incense, because we need to go back to the time of ancient eldritch horrors, which, for me, as a modern historian, is the medieval period. And we need to talk about religion. This is going to be intense. Forgive me, Father, for my thoughts wander. How many times a day do you think about, the Roman Empire? Because in the 1st century CE, a bloke called Charlemagne thought about it practically every waking minute. In the year 800, Charlemagne had been crowned Emperor of the Romans by none other than Pope Leo III. This was one in the long list of titles Charlemagne had held, including King of the Franks, a large post-Roman empire that spread into both the north and south of Europe. Quid agitur, those of you who think about the Roman Empire might ask. There were no real Romans left at this time. The Roman Empire had fallen to hordes of Goths and lead plumbing 300 years ago. There was no such thing as Emperor of the Romans anymore. Well, our friend Charlemagne and his friend Pope Leo wanted to change that. They wanted to bring back the concept of a Roman Empire, to resurrect the power and status and take it all for Rome, which was handily where the Pope lived. Sort of like an early return movement, these were people who thought the Romans did it better. But this wasn't bringing back pagan Rome. This was claiming the legacy of the Christian Roman Empire for the Western Catholic Church. Charlemagne and Pope Leo wanted to continue what had been started by Roman emperors like Constantine and Theodosius I. Fine. Not what I would have chosen to do, but apparently it seemed like a grand idea to build another powerful empire with Rome at its heart. But what it actually ended up doing was creating a permanent rift in the European continent. Because there was someone else who wanted to claim the legacy of Rome in the 1st century CE. Someone in the East. The Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. And why would Constantinople think that they were worthy of the Roman legacy? Well, perhaps because the very name of their city had come from the Emperor Constantine. Perhaps because the essence of the old Roman Christianity was woven into the very fabric of their culture. Their Eastern Christianity was the true heir to the Christian Roman Empire, not Charlemagne and Pope Leo's imposter Western Christianity. At least, that's what Constantinople thought. So here we have two manifestations of Christianity. Catholicism from the West, with Rome at its centre, and Orthodoxy from the East, with Constantinople at its centre, and both were vying for the powerful heritage of the Roman Church. And it was the Byzantines who took particular offence when Charlemagne was crowned emperor because he represented an authority being imposed upon them. It didn't help that Charlemagne had started acting like the full-blown emperor of the world before this, issuing laws like classical Rome used to do, and even proposing marriage to the Byzantine empress at the time, Irene. Irene said no, and Eastern Orthodoxy was even more vindicated in slamming the door and shouting, "You're not my real dad," at Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans. But just where is Russia in all of this? Well, at this point, Russia as we know it today didn't even exist. This was the era of Kievan Rus, a group of lands in the forest zone of Eastern Europe populated by tribal groups of Finns, Slavs and others, who were gradually coming together into the first East Slavic state. Things got more interesting in 988 CE, when Kievan Rus began to take on a more solid form as its leader, Prince Vladimir the Great, converted from Slavic paganism to Eastern Orthodoxy. Now this was partly a power move, and partly because he wanted to marry an Orthodox Christian princess. If he'd converted to Catholicism instead, the history of Europe may have turned out very differently. After Mr. Vladimir was baptized, Eastern Orthodox Christianity began to spread around Kievan Rus. It moved beyond Constantinople and Greece and began to look like a solid contender against the Western Catholicism that had been taking root in the northern bit of Western Europe. That is, the Frankish kingdom that had been Charlemagne's territory. For Vladimir, it made sense to ally himself and his lands with Constantinople. Even by the 10th century, Catholic Rome was essentially still in ruins, whereas the Byzantine Empire maintained trade routes, culture, knowledge, and of course, that old Roman prestige. Vladimir's conversion to Orthodoxy secured a new, separate sphere of influence for Eastern Orthodoxy, and put Kievan Rus in opposition to Catholic Rome and Western Europe. But we still haven't quite reached absolute breaking point. The two sides just about held it together past Charlemagne and past Vladimir the Great. It wasn't until 1054 that the Eastern and Western churches really had a total relationship meltdown. This was the 1054 Great Schism. By 1054, the Catholic West was rising out of the ruins of Rome to become more powerful once again. Constantinople and the East were losing their advantage. The time was just right for some theological dogma to come along and cause problems. In 1054, 2 centuries of dissonance and alienation finally manifested in a full-on religious disagreement. Now, we really don't want to get too deep into ecumenical matters here, so my short summary of this momentous event is simply that there were irreconcilable political, cultural, and theological differences between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. These included papal primacy, the hierarchy of the Holy Trinity, and whether to use leavened or unleavened bread in communion. And the Catholic Church got full custody of the Pope. But it was language that deepened the division again. Byzantines had always been snobby about barbarian languages from the West, including Latin. They much preferred the elegance of Greek for their religious ceremonies and writings. But Rome wanted a uniform use of Latin. And to make things more complicated, Kievan Rus wanted to worship in the Slavic language. And so this linguistic and religious fracture just never healed. Instead, it manifested in other forms. For example, the border between East and West can also be traced in church architecture. To the west, there are Gothic churches with their flying buttresses and grotesques. To the east, things get a lot more Byzantine, with domes, mosaics, and frescoes. Then in the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III doubled down even further on the split by starting a Baltic crusade to head east and go after those that disdained Catholic faith. This special military operation sent Teutonic Knights and Polish and Lithuanian Catholics to stamp out both paganism and Eastern Orthodoxy in Russia and other Slavic lands. The divide between East and West, and between Russia and the West, had begun as an issue of religion long before Russia itself had even emerged from the primordial ooze of modern state-making. East and West had been fractured since 1054. All that's changed is where the line has been drawn. In 1946, a man called Winston Churchill stood in a modest college gymnasium in the American Midwest and gave a speech that would conclusively divide modern Europe in two. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This Iron Curtain was a new political barrier that divided East and West in the post-war period. Winston hoped to rally the English-speaking world against what he saw as the emerging threat of Soviet Russia and the rise of a communist centre that coordinated the spread of communist offshoots throughout the world. These offshoots were fifth columns, groups of saboteurs working to undermine legitimate government and ideology. And Winston felt they posed a peril to Christian civilization. Someone who took offence to Winston's speech was historical true crime heartthrob Joe Stalin. So, in retaliation, Joe snarkily compared Winston to the recently deceased Adolf Hitler, saying in an interview with the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mr. Churchill too has begun the task of unleashing war with racial theory. You see, Stalin took mighty offence to Winston's assertion that only English-speaking nations are worthy of ruling the world, and that these nations should therefore band together against Russian communism. Stalin compared this to Hitler's idea that only German-speaking people were truly civilized. Winston's speech and its Iron Curtain metaphor is considered by many to be the beginning of the Cold War. That 45-year conflict of ideologies that taught everyone the phrase mutually assured destruction. And so the drapes descended. King James VI of Scotland, later also King James I of England, had some close encounters with witches and demons. In 1590, he took part in the North Berwick witch trials, on the side of the prosecution, of course. Executing about 70 innocent women and some men in the name of God shook the poor man up so much that he decided to write a lovely little reference book that would encourage others to do the same. Demonology, which was published in 1597 and was part of that period of panic when even looking at a black cat could get you hung. Now, in today's disenchanted, secular, modern, sensible, scientific society, we most certainly do not fall victim to moral panics and mob mentality. We are most certainly above smearing our political enemies with accusations of satanic immorality, and we would never invoke the binary black and white of good and evil. Would we? But why are we even talking about an early modern king and his personal demons when we are meant to be talking about Russophobia? Because there is such a thing as counter-subversive demonology, also known as political demonology. Put simply, political demonology, or counter-subversive demonology, your choice, is making monsters to represent your political enemies. It is the creation of a political evil or a political sin to fight against, to be the subject of your crusade. Your enemy needed to represent the exact opposite to everything you stand for. The Blofeld to your James Bond, the Joker to your Batman, your dark double. And the process of creating this evil, of imagining that your neighbour's morality is so very different to your own, is complicated. Demon crafting has its roots in who has power and how they control who they have power over. So let's break this down. An early modern demonologist, like our pal King James, sees the world as split into two, good and evil. Now, the issue is that, in this way of thinking, evil and all its horrors does not keep itself to itself, and instead, by some malign magical power, is constantly trying to infiltrate the world of good, light, and rainbows. There is a conspiratorial centre of evil, and bad stuff, little tentacles of rot, spread from it and grow in wider society. For King James, back in the 16th century, the conspiratorial centre was the devil, and the rot was witchcraft. For the West, it was Russia, and the rot was communism. The red octopus, grasping at whatever was in its reach. The demon, looking for souls to enslave. And in both cases, if this rot invaded the people, then the ruling power was under threat. Both communism and witchcraft were seen as anti-authority, a challenge to the state and the monarch. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had thrown Europe into a panic similar to the panic that the French Revolution inspired in the late 1700s. It was an upheaval of the established order and a destructive middle finger to those in power from those with less power. And the elites in other countries were worried it would happen to them. And so, communism and witchcraft are both subversive. They move beneath the surface of polite society and upset the status quo. And to combat the subversive, you have to become counter-subversive, like counter-terrorism. Get them before they get you. But let's look a bit more closely at who they are. Who are the communists? Who are the witches? And more importantly, who tells us who they are? And this takes us to World War II. This relatively major conflict provided a bit of a distraction from the fallout of World War I and the Russian Revolution. Old allegiances were broken and new ones were made. Switzerland ate popcorn on the side, and Russia did what they did and helped us all out. A lot. But because of their new Bolshevik ideology and identity, Russia was still not part of the Western in crowd. And after World War II came to its very bitter end, and fascism had been vanquished once and for all, there was a void left behind. The West, especially America, needed another enemy, another way to reinforce their identity by having someone to fight against. And this enemy would represent everything they were not. The US had emerged out of World War II as a valiant defender of freedom, honour, and good wholesome apple pie, capitalism and consumer culture. Communism became the opposition to this, the evil in competition that could taint, corrupt, and destroy everything that America had fought for. But this is nothing new. Over time, this evil has taken many forms, reflecting whatever fear is in fashion. Russia just happened to have the ideal opposite at this time. In 1964, televangelist, anti-sex education spokesman, and segregationist Billy James Hargis said, "The strategy of the evil one appears to change with the succeeding centuries. Today we find Satan incarnate in international communism and its offshoots in the United States, the far left." You see, modern politics and 16th century demons are really not that far apart. In the early modern era, witchcraft represented a challenge to authority. God is the obvious authority under threat there, but at this point the king was so strongly linked to God that you can't really separate them. Therefore, witchcraft and demons were a threat to any form of sovereignty and authority, challenging the monarchy here on Earth and His Holiness upstairs. This is the same threat that the US government felt that they were under, and the same threat that would keep haunting them throughout the 20th century. A threat to political sovereignty in the same way that King James's occult beings had come for him and his godly crown in the night. Communism became America's witch, the demon menacing the USA and the world. Winston's fifth column and threat to Christian civilization. Communism was yet another Russian attempt at world domination, from Russian octopus to communist Russian octopus. The Cold War was an ideological conflict, and for several decades the world watched in anticipation of disaster as capitalism fought it out with this communism. And when Mikhail Gorbachev stood at the same podium graced by Winston in the American Midwest and proclaimed hostilities were over, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. Western liberal democracy had been adopted as the final form of human government. Liberalism had claimed its victory over absolutist rule. There was an air of optimism in the West. American academic Francis Fukuyama dramatically proclaimed that this was the end of history, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution. Apart from some minor issues in the Balkans, that was it. America had won. Everyone could now bask in the new world of freedom and democracy. There was no more history. Well, pack it up, lads. Time to go into archaeology. But you might have noticed that since then, some history has happened. We've come all this way and there is still a bear in the room. Where does the term Russophobia even come from? Well, Russia. It comes from Russia. And perhaps this is not surprising. It makes sense that Russia would think of a word to label the vibes they got from their judgmental Western neighbours. But what if I told you that Russophobia was a word that originally referred to self-hating people from Russia itself? It wasn't originally meant to mean Westerners at all. The first Russophobes were Russians. Today, the Russian state has repurposed the term to attack its enemies outside the country. The Kremlin shouts Russophobia to silence anyone who calls them out on, well, anything at all. If you attack Russian politics, then you are in fact attacking Russia itself. If you criticize Russia's military decisions, then you have in fact criticized every decision the great country of Russia has ever made and insulted every Russian's grandma. The Kremlin-supporting Russian media use Russophobia to tell Russian citizens that the world is scared of Russia's distinctiveness. Russophobes want to prevent Russia from taking its rightful place in the world hierarchy, and they are envious of Russia's potential. And the Russian media are able to do this because of the origins of Russophobia. Both the original meaning and the modern meaning come from this idea that Russia is a unique and special country, just like every other country. So let's go back to this original meaning and unpick this uniqueness. It was Fyodor Tyutchev, a Russian poet, who first used Russophobia in a letter to his daughter in 1867. Fyodor was part of a Russian movement which wanted the country to modernize on Russian terms, not according to whatever the West was up to. He was a Slavophile, someone really into Russian and Slavic culture. Fyodor thought Russia should make its own way in the world because its Slavic culture and Slavic foundations made it distinct. But apparently during the 19th century, not every Russian was as into this national Slavic pride as Fyodor. And this is where things get complicated. Since the 1700s, liberal Western ideas have been making their way around the world. Modernization inspired by Western countries like Britain, France, and Germany was the latest trend, and people had mixed opinions about it. In Russia, it was our old pal Peter the Great who started this push towards modernization and Europeanization in the 1700s. He was inspired by Western models of doing things. But what he didn't realise is that he'd started a trend that would become a bit of a problem later. Under the rule of Catherine the Great, modernisation really took off as the Russian Enlightenment kicked in. Russia was moving forward in science and thinking and ideas. Other countries were also having their own enlightenments, and everyone was learning how to think differently, and everyone was having a bit of a crisis. In Russia, a group of people emerged who started to think about Russian identity. Questions like, why are we here? Where are we going? And do we fit in with everyone else? Were the hot conversation topics at all the trendy parties throughout the 19th century. And people started to pick sides. This is the crisis bit. Fyodor the poet was part of the trend of people who felt Russian traditions were under threat from European and Western models of reform. Some Russians were more like Peter the Great, well up for a bit of westernization. And to Fyodor, these were the Russians who were the Russophobes. They were willing to lose their country's tradition in favour of an outside, foreign influence. They were westernizers. Fyodor was a Slavophile. They wanted to embrace new ways of doing things with open arms. Fyodor was more interested in looking back at Slavic and Russian tradition to find meaning and identity in the modern world. And like I said, Fyodor was part of a trend of people who felt this way. 30 years earlier, Stepan Shiviryov systematically insulted some Western European countries. Italy was poor and backward. They'd had a great start with the Romans, but they didn't really do much with it, and now were just there to serve as artistic inspiration for everyone else. Britain was industrial and vigorous, which is all very well and good, but spiritually they were circling the drain and at death's door. And as for the French, well, spiritually they were too far gone. Shiviryov called them soulless creatures. Although, to be fair, so did the Brits. Shiviryov thought Western Europe was a hot mess, with these different countries and no uniting light. And he was convinced that their Catholic foundations were the problem. So you may be noticing a spiritual trend here. In the 1850s, Ivan Kireevsky, another pro-Russian bloke, told everyone how good it was that Russia had split with the Catholic Church back in the day. And that's the whole Great Schism drama we talked about earlier. Roman heritage was all very well and good, but the Romans had been too focused on rationalism and personal gain. Any unity in their culture was artificial, fake, and inauthentic. Whereas Eastern Orthodoxy had kept that community spirit and had a strong and powerful sense of unity like the Slavic villages of old. The West was spiritually broken and corrupt. It was Russia who had kept true Christianity alive for all these centuries in Eastern Orthodoxy. Catholic Rome was the Antichrist. This is what Fyodor and other anti-Western intellectuals in the 1800s had at the root of their thought, a romantic notion of Russia's past glory and religious superiority, and a rejection of any need to look to the West for a way forward. Russia had everything they needed in their own culture and their own past. Which is certainly fair. No country should be under the obligation to follow a path that is not right for them, provided their citizens are safe and happy. Russia is not automatically the bad guy for giving Western modernization and reforms the side eye. But today, Putin is taking Russia further and further into an isolation that has them as the last vanguard against moral decay. Because the trouble starts when differences between countries become perceived moral differences. Some people in Russia at the moment are so convinced of the country's spiritual purity that they think everyone else is, well, evil and Russophobic. And it's much easier to rally a nation against enemies who are demons and sinners. Looking at this in 2024, you might say our situation is shockingly grim.
Our situation is shockingly grim.
On the 22nd of July, there was an incident at a DHL warehouse in Birmingham. A parcel that had come in by plane caught fire. Thankfully, no one was hurt. In Leipzig, also in July, another package caught fire at another DHL building. This parcel hadn't arrived by air, but was soon going to be leaving by air. If either of these fires had started on a flight, they could have taken down the plane. British authorities didn't tell anyone about the Birmingham incident at first. It was the Guardian newspaper and German broadcasters WDR and NDR who hassled counter-terrorism people until the story came out. It turns out that these packages were probably planted by Russia to try and cause disruption and spread fear. Then, in early October, Director General of MI5, Ken McCallum, gave a national security update full of dire warnings about the threat Russia poses to the UK. Now, despite what Russian news may want to tell you, this is not a threat from nukes. This is a more insidious, creeping menace. In many ways, the same thing Britain felt during the Great Game, except this time it's right on our doorstep, not in Central Asia. Since Putin invaded Ukraine, 750 Russian diplomats have been removed from Europe. Most of them were spies. Kick them out, keep them out is Ken's motto. And Russian bots are out there living their best life. Racial tensions are being stoked by shadowy figures, and Russia is passing money to right-wing organisations to fuel division and malcontent. Remember that Nigel Farage himself has appeared on Russia Today several times. He can be bought with Russian cash. And in the aftermath of the tragic murder of 3 children in Southport, riots erupted across England and Northern Ireland, driven by misinformation that seems to have come from Russia. Ken says that Russia is going to keep aggressively pushing the boundaries in Western Europe, testing for weakness. The Kremlin will continue using proxies to do their dirty work. Cyber warfare and untrustworthy actors are a constant threat. We must be vigilant. And this means we have to ask, are we at war with Russia and we don't even know it? Is this a hybrid conflict? Is this a new, modern warfare that has quietly crept up on us? I don't ask whether we're at war with Russia to scare anyone. I don't want a new wave of Russophobia, although I think it's a bit late to prevent that, really. Because Russophobia is the unjustified, exaggerated fear of Russia. A phobia is the kind of thing you see a therapist for because when it comes down to it, you know logically that you are overreacting. As terrifying as that spider in the corner is, you probably shouldn't burn your house down instead of just gently letting it out of the window to be on its way. Over the centuries, plenty of people have been scared of Russia when instead they should have been talking to Russia. But a lot of our problems right now come from the fact that we don't know what the real threat is. The media on both sides wants to sell emotion. Russian state propaganda wants its people to feel justified about invading their neighbour, so they tell everyone Ukraine was under neo-Nazi control, which is not true, just in case I need to point that out. And UK propaganda outlets often want to stoke panic. These are often the same ones that seem to low-key tease the idea of Russia as being a sanctuary from Western wokeness. So in the lead up to today's tensions, both sides have played their part in riling everyone up. Russia has featured as the villain so frequently in Western culture. Evil Russia is in our media. Evil Russia is part of our cultural memory. Evil Russia is in our James Bond films and other assorted espionage thrillers. And recently, the evil Russia trend has continued with Putin as the chief bad guy. But it's not always been that black and white. Putin has been in power as Prime Minister since 2000, and then as President since 2012. Looking back now, we can see how we got here with Russia, but when Putin first arrived at the party, it actually seemed like he might be on the moderate side. There was potential that he would cooperate with the West. So what changed in his 20 or so years in power? In the early 1990s, the Iron Curtain was stashed haphazardly in the back of the airing cupboard, and the West were looking suspiciously at what they found behind it. And not just at the 15 countries that the USSR had engulfed and then spat back out, but at Russia itself. Now that it was free of communist rot, would it try and join the Western gang? Would it revive the Europeanization that had started to take root in the late 19th century before a series of unfortunate events came along and ruined everything? Or would Russia just do a quick costume change and continue to haunt Western nightmares? Optimism at the time came in the form of our old friend Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev oversaw the collapse of communism, the fall of the wall, and wanted to bring Eastern Europe back into the Western fold. He declared that the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, Moldovians, Lithuanians, Lets, Estonians, Karels, and of course the Russians had all made a sizable contribution to the development of European civilization. And he challenged everyone to rethink their mental maps of Europe and break down the imagined barriers between East and West. And when Boris Yeltsin became the first president of the brand new Russian Federation that replaced the USSR, he also took a friendlier approach to US-Russia relations. For a while. He even said, "We have left behind the period when America and Russia looked at each other through gun sights." Except this didn't last. Russia didn't seem to take too well to the liberal economic reforms that were replacing Soviet centralized economics. And in the mid to late 1990s, people who disagreed with Yeltsin started to speak up. Russia was making too many concessions to the West, the economy was too weak, NATO's expansion was a bit of a threat. Discontent was on the rise in Russia, but it hadn't yet turned into bitterness. Then came Putin. He'd never been fond of America, he thought it was a little too hungry for power after the Cold War. He felt that the US was interfering with the countries around Russia, undermining Russia's influence, and this is not exactly untrue. After the Soviet Union fell, America took advantage of the power vacuum left behind in former Soviet-occupied countries and started handing over financial assistance. By 2005, they had given over $26 billion to 12 post-Soviet states. This legislation was called the Freedom for Russia and Emerging Eurasian Democracies and Open Markets Support Act. The Freedom Support Act. Freedom. Get it? And I say take advantage of not because I think the US shouldn't have handed over the cash. We all have a duty to support each other in these trying times. But because I think it also gave the US an opportunity to do what the US loves to do. Make itself look like the hero and associate itself with positive, lovely things, and link Russia and communism with negativity and oppression. The USSR also left a sort of an ideological power vacuum, and the US wanted to fill this with capitalism and its own special take on the free market. And again, don't come for me here. I don't think the USSR was a good thing, but let's not kid ourselves that America had entirely selfless intentions. Handing out wads of cash is a good way to win friends and influence people. America had set about establishing a soft power in a strategically important part of the world, and Putin did not like this. He still had grandiose visions of Russia regaining its old Soviet empire, just without the communism. By the early 2000s, he had become obsessed with old imperial-style conquest. He wanted his country to have a sphere of influence. So in 2012, Putin resumed his role as Russian president, and things took another turn for the worse. This time Putin wanted to strengthen the EEU, the Eurasian Economic Union, an Eastern European competitor to the EU. This would establish Russia's dominance in the area, and this is where Ukraine comes in. Viktor Yanukovych, president of Ukraine at the time, pitted the EU and the EEU against each other in a tense standoff, telling both the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union that Ukraine wanted to join them. He even scheduled a signing ceremony with the EU, the European Union, in the autumn of 2013, but then he backed out. In November, he told everyone that Ukraine would instead be joining the Eurasian Economic Union. Putin would have been pleased, but the people of Ukraine were not. There were protests, and eventually Viktor turned tail and fled. To Russia. The government that replaced him matched the wishes of the Ukrainian people. They were pro-EU and pro-West. And this is why Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014. This is why Russia annexed Crimea. Not because he was afraid that the EU were grabbing territory, but because the Ukrainian people had decided they would rather be in a customs union with Western Europe, not Putin's fledgling Russian empire. So when Putin sang Blueberry Hill to a mindless celebrity horde in 2010 at a fundraiser for a children's charity in St. Petersburg, 4 years before he first really showed the world his true face, he was trying to turn on the charm. He wanted to convince everyone that everything was still okay, that Russia was still going to be your friend. Here I am, your friendly dictator singing a Fats Domino song because I know you Westerners like this stuff. And now Putin is a dominant force in every aspect of Russian policy. And he has been developing some serious grudges and a real victim complex. Because he seems to feel that Russia is him and he is Russia, he takes every geopolitical slight very personally. And his own instability is now an integral part of the country's national security, like a rotten egg baked into a Spartak cake. And as he slips further into the void, he has started invoking history to help him legitimize his instability. He is now calling back to that glorious time when Russia was Kievan Rus. He uses this evocative idea of Russia's historical sprawling sphere of influence and territory to summon people into a war to win it back. For Russia, these ancient times should never have gone away. What the country had in the past, it should have now. This is Putin weaponizing history, using past glories to influence present policy, which as a responsible historian is my least favourite thing. He is joined in this crusade by the Russian Orthodox Church. Like we talked about earlier, they are convincing themselves, and many Russians, that Russia is spiritually superior to everyone else. Putin's orthodoxy sees Russia as the katechon, literally the biblical figure said to restrain the Antichrist. And the Russian Orthodox Church, like Putin, is spreading the idea that the West is Russophobic. They are planting seeds of division and watching them flower. The Church promotes traditional Russian values and strongly opposes Western liberal ideas. And Putin has jumped in with them on this, telling everyone within earshot that Western liberalism is a direct path to degradation and primitivism, to a profound demographic and moral crisis. Putin is setting the West up as Russia's dark double, using the same language of morality and virtue that America used against Russia in the Cold War. These are moral binaries that have existed since before the fake testament of Peter the Great burst onto the scene to cause chaos. Each side sees the other as a demon, and on each side, people are using the existence of a demon to further their own political goals. And so political demonology will not be leaving us anytime soon. The media and many politicians see themselves as witchfinder generals. They will always find and expose people and ideas that they consider damned and degraded. This is because they can make money and gain power from the fear that this degradation will cause society to rot out from under your feet. Nothing ended with the schism. Nothing ended when the Soviet Union fell, and the great game is still being played. So, in conclusion, Fukuyama was wrong.